Hey guys, this is a specific video that's very important. It's my introductory video. If you haven't had a chance to go knee to knee with me when we talk about your results, this particular video may be sent to you for you to become aware of the different philosophy, components, and the premise of the practice. And so as I start with this, we're going to use this whiteboard here behind me to kind of explain the 4 or 5 different components and pieces that you need to understand as I set up this kind of introduction to the way in which we can talk about a new way to think. Because the premise and the understanding is that the reason you are where you are is because you've done what you've done to get to that point. And the reason why we do the certain things is because we thought a certain way. So if we think a certain way and we continue to think that way, we're always going to get the same results. I think Einstein was the one who was quoted as saying, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing the same way, trying to get different results. Whatever the actions were that got us into a problem, we're going to need different actions to get us out. And unfortunately, those different actions also need a new premise, they need a new philosophy, and they need a new understanding. So if we haven't had a chance to really hammer these different points through, you may be asked to watch this video to kind of get a little bit more information and take some time to go over this explanation again in greater detail on your own time. So we're going to start with the top corner and through here. And this is something that we talk about in the clinic day in and day out, that it's a nerve. That's what the N stands for. The nerve controls the muscle, and the muscle moves your joint. And each of these areas, each of these different systems should have 100% capacity for whole function. And as that nerve controls the muscle, if there's full function of the nerve, we call it recruitment. So if the nerve is if it fully has the bandwidth to control the muscle, and the pipe is open as wide as it possibly can be, and the upload and the download speed through the internet is powerful enough to handle the file that you want to get through there in a certain time that you want, then the muscle's going to work properly. And if the muscle is fully recruited and fully available, the whole muscle will then have the possibility of growing and becoming bigger when you exercise it. And that muscle will then be able to move the joint. And the joint needs to be properly aligned, and the joint needs to be properly in place so that when the muscle moves it, it's able to give you the greatest amount of power to do whatever it is that you want to do. And if all of these 3 things are going out of a potential of 300, then you have what's called whole function, and everything is whole and functioning. But oftentimes what happens, and why people come into the clinic with some type of pain, is because there's been a breakdown in one of these 3 different systems. And that breakdown in these 3 different systems is what we call dysfunction. So something has happened where one of these numbers is less than 100, or maybe all of them have become less. And we'll talk about that in a minute as to how that happens. But all of these different numbers, or maybe a couple of them, have become less than 100. Let's say this one's dropped down to 75%. Well, now this one will be less than or equal to 75. And this one will be less than or equal to 75 as well. Well, now you've got less than whole function. And that's what we call dysfunction. And so bad function or dysfunction occurs when the supply that we have does not meet the demand. So the demand could be how you lift, it could be how you walk, or how you sit, or whatever it might be. Whatever that demand is, if that demand is too high and our capacity or our supply is not high enough to match it, that means that there's actually a debt. There's a supply debt to the demand. That creates a dysfunction. And that dysfunction leads to an increase in the inflammatory process, and that increase in inflammation leads to an increase in pain. So when most people come in with pain, it's usually because there's been some type of threshold met with an increase in the inflammatory process, because there's a dysfunction that occurs, which is a mismatch in supply and demand, which is what I'm very good at trying to determine how to modulate or how to prepare the body to handle that demand, because that supply that we're talking about is actually based upon whether there's a joint problem, a muscular problem, or a nerve problem. With me so far? This is critical in terms of understanding these first 3 little graphs that I've drawn here. Because what happens is, and the main reason why this has such a problem is because the spine interferes with the way in which that nerve is firing. So what ends up happening is that when you have your spine and it's meant to move and it's meant to have each segment well-oiled and lubricated like a well-oiled bicycle chain that's able to show lower back movement where each one contributes to the overall function of that particular movement and that particular load that becomes a demand that you have to supply. If you don't have that, then you have a dysfunction that over time leads to increased inflammation, increase in pain, because there's a breakdown in this particular equation in some way. And oftentimes what you'll see me talk about and hear me say to you personally in the clinic is that your spine's purpose is to protect it, and we want to go upstream far enough to make sure that this is actually firing this, because most of what therapy is in this world here of just muscle work, of massage, or joint work, of physio, and they don't look at what the spine's purpose or potential purpose might be, because what it should be doing is protecting. So we see the brain here. The brain is protected by the skull. That's the helmet. And then there's what I call a vertical cord that goes down the center part, because your spine is actually hollow. What's interesting is that your spine actually is hollow. The cord actually comes out of a hole in the skull and goes down the center part of your spine. And so as you bend, as your head moves, your spine is moving your head. Your spine is allowing you to have functional movement, but the cord is inside, this vertical cord that I call it, and you need to be able to have the spine move in such a way that the vertical cord does not actually come up against the edges of the inside edges of the spine. And then there's what's also called the horizontal cord. And the horizontal cord is also called a nerve root. So the nerve root is this large nerve of capacity to bring all types of information to the muscle, to an organ, and to a gland. So when I'm muscle testing you, I'm testing a muscle for its strength in this process as a means of understanding how well that particular nerve is firing. And if that nerve is firing well, then the muscle will be strong. But if it's not strong, it means that there's been a decrease in the power of that particular nerve, because I may have tested you with your arm out in front, and I may have had you look at the strength of the deltoid, which comes from nerve root 5, fifth number down, fifth nerve root down. As you turn your head to one side or to the other, I would have tested it, and if your neck was turning your head to the right and it went weak, or to the left, or down, or looking up, then what that means is that the spine has actually transferred its protective qualities into an interfering quality and decreased the power. But here's what's really cool, is that that muscle that tests that level is also checking that level for the organ capacity and the gland capacity. Because we know from studies on cadavers that when there's a change in the curve of the spine or a change in the integrity of the spine to protect, that there's organ decay and glandular decay that causes and sets up a disease process. Now it takes a long time to show up, but this makes sense, doesn't it? Because if a wire is not working right, then anything that wire goes to, any type of switch or plug, will also have a problem. Well, if you're with me so far and you've gotten how all these different pieces work together, then this last graph over here is really the tour de force of what I'm trying to say. Because what we know from research is that we should be able to do what's called compression of morbidity, where at the end of life, we have a very short window of time where we are experiencing the end of our life. No one's going to get out of life alive, okay? Hate to say it, but it's how you get there and the quality of life that's very important. So research by James Fries has proven that we should spend as much time as possible in the highest percentage of function. This is function of performance, capacity, or ability on this side. Down here is death. Along here is time. This is in years, and we should live to 120. But the average age is about 82, and the last part of one's life is lived in disability. So that's where you have a diagnosis, there's signs and symptoms, there's pain, a positive lab test, below some level of X% in this particular area. But here's what's really cool. Everything from X plus 1% up to 99% will be pain-free, diagnosis-free, signs and symptoms-free, and negative lab. So it begs the question, where would you rather live? Down here, just before you have some type of diagnosis, because once you have a diagnosis, now you have a disease, right? Which is having like a dis-ease. And now you are no longer well, because when you're in this area here, this is when you are well. Because remember, that the idea of health and wellness is 100% functioning of all organ systems all the time, and not merely the absence of disease. So as you progress down through here because of stresses, different types of stressors, like accidents or other types of challenges push us down, the only way to create a curve that goes back up is to add some type of energy into the system. Just like a farmer or a gardener would add water and nutrition and good soil to grow the vegetables or to grow the plants, so you have to add things into the process to get this to expand. And so this is the philosophy. The different tests we use are different ways to benchmark where you're going, just like an athlete preparing for a sport. If he wants to compete at the Olympic level, he'll have to be in the top 10% of the world. If you want to live life long and live life large for a lifetime, you're going to have to add energy into it. And so this is the type of conversation that we have in and around the first couple of days. And this video, again, was just shot to give you perspective, to go back and understand that these are the things that we'll start looking at. We'll start looking at how nerves control muscles and muscles move joints for whole function. We'll talk about how your dysfunction led to inflammation and then to pain that drove you in. How it's really an equation of supply and demand, and how the brain and the nervous system have to work, and how we use muscles as a way of understanding other types of technology to measure the health of the brain and the nervous system, because your whole life is lived through your central nervous system. And how this graph of life, I call it, is a graph that depicts really in a nutshell what we're trying to achieve. And in this world here, because there is no pain, we need some type of milestone process or some type of benchmark to actually understand what it is we're doing. So guys, that's it. I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope it's made sense. Ask questions, give the clinic a call, and we'll see you on the inside.